The message is, from Iran's point of view, we're here to stay.
Yeah.
Whether you like us or not, we are a power in the region. We can strike back to Israel directly if we choose to, if our interests are harmed. And you've just got to accept that. Now, Israel, after this, is in a bind. It wants to strike back immediately. That's what Netanyahu absolutely wanted to do, because that was his script.
Welcome to the Big Picture podcast. My name is Mohammed Hassan, and today we are talking about Iran, Israel, and the threats of wider war in the Middle East. We are joined today by Middle East Eye's editor-in-chief, David Hearst. David, welcome back to the podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
So just before most of us were about to go to sleep, sometimes, some of us may have been asleep already on Saturday night, we all got this news of this retaliatory attack from Iran on Israel. It was 2 weeks in the making. The Iranian government had been promising that there would be some kind of show of force in retaliation, of course, to Israel's attack on its embassy complex in Syria and Damascus at the beginning of April. Nobody predicted that it would look like this, that it would be at this scale. 300 drones, missiles launched from Iranian territory into Israel. Most of it was intercepted. Some of it wasn't intercepted. It ranged in scale and in scope. But certainly, I think a lot of people have described this as unprecedented. What do you make of what we saw on Saturday and what it means?
Firstly, let's go back to answer that question. What Israel actually did at the beginning of April. And why the Iranians felt they had to react to it in the way that they did. If you remember, you cast your mind back, the war then and is now, it was not going well for Netanyahu. Hamas showed no signs of putting its hands up in the air and surrendering. They had rejected a proposal for the leadership to be exiled. They're taking their time about replying to the latest ceasefire negotiations through Cairo. They're showing every sign of weathering the storm. And Netanyahu is facing increasing pressure at home to get these hostages, the remaining hostages, back alive. He hasn't had any major scalps. He hasn't killed Hamas leaders, or the big ones, the big four. That launched the October the 7th attack. And he's coming under huge international pressure to get aid into Gaza as mass famine takes over. And the differences and the splits between him and Joe Biden, the US president, are now public.
Well, now you have a U.S. administration that is essentially openly calling for him to step down and to be pushed aside.
Yeah, and it's all out in public. It's not private. It is, and it becomes public very quickly. Therefore, Netanyahu, the gambler, needed another throw of the dice. And what he did was hit the Iranian consulate, which contained Iran's top soldier, along with 7 other commanders of the Revolutionary Guards. Now, this wasn't like any other hit that had been done before, and that you can put them into 2 categories. One is you hit the guards that are controlling the flow or organizing the flow of traffic and arms to Hezbollah and other militias in Lebanon on the northern border of Israel. And the other broad area of recognized Israeli military activity in that area is to push the militias away from the border, at least north of the Litani River. Now, this attack was nothing to do with either Hezbollah or arms or anything else. It was to wipe out the Iranian leadership in Syria. And therefore, and do it in an Iranian consulate as well. Now, if you attack a consulate, you attack a country.
You're asking for a response.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this was clearly what Iran was faced with, was a scenario and a script that had been written by Israel before they did anything. So their reply to it was, I think, quite interesting and very typical of the way they think strategically. I don't think their aim was necessarily to strike big targets in Israel. I think their aim was to choreograph what a mass attack would look like if it actually happened, and do it in a way which really frightened both the countries around Israel, the US, and Israel itself. And so this is more like a ballet. This is more like a choreographed, which is why it all seems so bizarre.
Yeah.
So in the morning, if you go back to those events, I think on Saturday, they seized a Portuguese flagged vessel in the Strait of Hormuz, and they did it completely openly. It's the IRGC landing in a helicopter and saying, we're taking over this vessel. This vessel is Portuguese flagged, but it's basically owned by a company that's linked to an Israeli-born billionaire in Monaco. So they knew exactly what they were doing, right? This was, we're seizing this container vessel. It's Israeli linked or Israeli. And we can show you by doing this that we can control the flow of traffic through the vital Straits of Hormuz. That was message number one. Message number two was to let loose all these drones, which were basically decoys, and tell people we have now launched the drones, right? You've got 8 hours to respond. It's a very odd way to attack a country, by telling you in advance that they've actually launched the missile. And then came the wave of, but the real weapons were the ballistic missiles. And although most of them were intercepted, a few got few. We don't know the damage done to the southern Israeli base. But there was a Bedouin girl who was killed by shrapnel. I would imagine the damage was fairly big.
Yeah, Iran is claiming that it was significant damage and it was very targeted. Israel is claiming that it was insignificant and that they stopped.
We won't
most
actually
of the
know the
damage.
truth because we won't know. I have a feeling from previous Iranian hits, ballistic missile hits in Iraq, and that was after the targeted assassination of Qasem Soleimani under Trump. That was back in 2020. That was a pretty big hit.
Well, let's talk about Soleimani because it bears a lot of similarities, right? This was a targeted assassination of a very senior, Qasem Soleimani was the most senior military figure in the country. He was assassinated in Iraq by Trump at the time. Iran vowed to respond, and then a few weeks later, it attacked and basically empty military U.S. base in Iraq.
Soleimani, the interesting thing about that, one extra detail about that was that Soleimani was acting as a sort of diplomat go-between, and he was flying on a commercial flight. He was attacked as he came off the plane in his convoy, along with a Shia militia leader. This was all very vague stuff. It wasn't Soleimani acting as the Quds force commander. It was Soleimani was Iran's chief diplomat on the ground, and he was assassinated while he was carrying a proposal for Iraq and for Syria. So very odd, and Lebanon. Yeah. So again, this was he was hit in a way that the Iranians could regard as below the
belt.
Below the belt.
Yeah.
Because he was going to and fro with peace proposals.
Well, and this is the interesting thing, is that you talked about this kind of ballet that is happening, and the way that Iran deals with the U.S. often feels like that there is this kind of very public adversarial relationship. There are all of these public threats, and then there are things that happen in between, this kind of push and pull. The U.S. is very well aware of a lot of these movements that Iran has in the region, especially through its proxy sites, and it chooses to strike some of them and not strike some of them. Israel is often kind of that intermediary that regularly strikes Iranian targets in Syria and in Iraq, and they're usually above the belt, as you describe. What happened 2 weeks ago was another one of those below the belt strikes, but the Iranian response this time around is a lot more bold, it is a lot more public, and it is a lot more threatening. than what we saw happen in 2020. What do you think has changed in between? I mean, one obvious one is that it's retaliating against Israel as opposed to the United States.
Well, there was an assumption that that Iran didn't want to get into a war, and therefore they were restraining themselves. There was a similar assumption about Hamas, that Hamas was not interested in a fight. It did nothing. It stayed right back when Israel hit the three main commanders of the Islamic Jihad. And Israel was lulled into a false sense of belief that Hamas was not up for the fight anymore. And then Hamas did. In exactly the same way, Iran said repeatedly and behaved as if they did not want to escalate things on the border. They were prepared to operate through the Houthis and through other groups on the border, and they weren't going to get involved themselves. Now, of course, this happens. I think the messages that Iran wanted to convey were more important than the missiles themselves. And the messages were, yes, we can strike back at you, and we don't need Hezbollah to do it, and we can hit you hard if we want to. This is just a free sample of what we've got, but you'll find it difficult. You'll realize that you needed an awful lot of protection from at least 5 other countries, probably 7 actually, because Saudi Arabia may have got involved as well because it came over their territory, and Egypt may have got involved. But let's just say 5 extra countries helped Israel shoot down these drones. That would have been US, UK, France, Jordan. 4.
I think the estimation was that it cost about $1 billion.
And it cost about $1 billion. Yeah, that's right. $1 billion on the Israeli side, but probably much more on the US, UK, France, and Jordanian side as well. And so, and they know that the West can mount this aerial defense system once. Right, but it just can't stay the distance. And they know that from Ukraine. The Ukrainian reaction was actually quite interesting. They said, well, that's interesting. They're making all these efforts to shoot down these drones. Why don't they do the same thing for Russian drones?
Right.
So there's a big message here. The message is, from Iran's point of view, we're here to stay.
Yeah.
Whether you like us or not, we are a power in the region. We can strike back to Israel directly if we choose to, if our interests are harmed. And you've just got to accept that. Now, Israel, after this, is in a bind. It wants to strike back immediately. That's what Netanyahu absolutely wanted to do because that was his script. It was right. Okay, this has taken the attention of Israel, the aggressor, the genocidal aggressor in Gaza, and Israel now becomes a victim again, which has to fight back against an irredentist Iranian regime that just simply wants to wipe us off the map. And that's a very, very easy narrative for the West to accept. And it's the one that is now today in Parliament going to be pushed, that we have to deal with Iran. This is why we have to defend Israel, because Israel is surrounded by people who want to wipe it off the map. That narrative will not, of course, include the fact that this is all part of Netanyahu's script in the first place. And Netanyahu has tried at least 3 times in the last 14 years to get America to get sucked into a big aerial attack on Iran, and particularly on its nuclear facilities. And each time they've been thwarted. Now, the difference is Iran seized this fact, it struck back, and Israel was stopped by Biden, or has so far been stopped by Biden, who said several times, we don't want to get into this regional war. Cameron is making the same message. So as things stand, it may not last for that much longer, but as things stand, Netanyahu is now in a weaker position. His bluff has been called by Iran. He is a power that needs the protection of at least 5 other air forces to stop these things from flooding his air defense systems. he can't afford to defend himself with these extremely expensive weapons against these really garage-made drones, very cheap drones, and he can't reply in kind because he's being stopped by America. So he needs America's protection, he needs Western protection, but Israel is not free at the moment to do actually what it wants. So this idea that Israel that had of itself, that it is free to roam the region and employ all sorts of horrible suburban metaphors. What they once said, and a war in Gaza was like cutting the grass. That era is gone. And what we're left with is a much more volatile landscape filled with highly armed militias that have the power to strike back at Israel and are in fact establishing their own deterrence on Israel. It's not Israel just establishing the deterrence on Hezbollah or on Iran or on the Iran-backed militias in Iraq. It's the other way around.
Well, let's talk about the U.S. and the relationship between Netanyahu and Biden, because this is also the bluff that Netanyahu has been calling repeatedly on behalf of his allies in the U.S., where very early on there was this private, very quiet, very timid call for restraint from the U.S., which was ignored by Netanyahu repeatedly and at several stages over the last 6 months. And Netanyahu's gambit seems to be that you can say what you want, but are you really going to walk away from this? Are you going to walk away from what we're doing and your commitment to protecting Israel's security? And at almost every stage, the U.S. response has been, okay, we're still going to protect you, but you need to stop. You need to pull back. And we saw this in the tensions between Israel and Hezbollah, where at some moments it seemed like Netanyahu was trying to spark a much wider escalation with Hezbollah in order to keep the U.S. from pulling out its Navy vessels and pulling out its military from the region, which it has to some extent, but obviously still kind of retains a little bit of a presence. Now there seems to be this another moment of where Netanyahu seems to be calling Biden's bluff and saying, okay, well, you said you made a very public commitment to me on Saturday morning that you're going to protect us against Iran, and you have protected us, and now what are you going to do if I decide to strike back? What do you think the position that Biden is in right now? I mean, like if Israel does decide to go ahead and strike Iran, is the U.S. really going to hold itself back the way that it's at least signaling publicly?
I wouldn't quite put it like that. I think the pressure's on Netanyahu rather than America. I mean, America, we can go into this. America is running out of policy options. But does Netanyahu really want to defy Biden again? What would an Israeli attack on Iran be like physically if they didn't have support through the airspace and the 1,000 kilometers that separate them over hostile airspace and without the refueling tankers? Now, presumably the answers to that, these are all the objections to a direct attack the last time, but this is all now old. Maybe Israel has worked out how to fly planes there, get them refueled mid-air and then come back, or worked out other ways of firing missiles into Israel. But it would be done without US cover. And Iran has said, if we are attacked, we'll attack US bases. And that means that they would potentially, number one on their list would be the US base in the United Arab Emirates, which is one of the main activity, from where the main activity has come in the past. So immediately, all US air bases in the region will become vulnerable to swarms of drones. And it would set the region on fire, literally set the region on fire. You'd have petrol production. All of those are ancillary things. This is not. This is like a tinderbox. This is not. All of these are the consequences of what would be a third Gulf War.
Which would be insane, and this is the exact thing that everybody's been trying to avoid.
Yeah. So
apart from seemingly Netanyahu,
that is the pressure on and behind Netanyahu. Right now, that's what. So I think there's more pressure on Netanyahu at the moment than there is on America. Now, on America itself, I think what you're getting is the slow realization that another major policy in the last 3 decades about the Middle East and Central Asia is coming apart in their hands. It's crumbling. And that major policy decision was to back Israel to the hilt on October the 7th and back it all the way with arms right up until today. And that's looking like a huge mistake. A mistake as big as trying to topple the Taliban in Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, toppling Muammar Gaddafi, trying to topple Bashar al-Assad and failing. All of these are policy failures, right? And this is a policy failure over Israel, partially because Israel hasn't succeeded in its objectives. It's now become a forever war. And Netanyahu's only answer, it hasn't defeated Hamas. Hamas aren't surrendering. They aren't going into exile. And they appear to be confident about their ability to keep on coming. They think the worst is over, or they've gone so far. Why not go on in the same place? They've suffered so much. I mean, there's different ways of putting it. And the pressure's on Netanyahu to get a result, A, from his own people to stop the war, but also to get his hostages out. But to get a result, to actually say that we want. The one thing that Netanyahu really the one thing the Israeli army really fears is the moment when there's a ceasefire, the war stops, and Hamas comes out of its bunkers with flags saying, we've won.
Yeah.
That's what they fear. That's the real thing. So the only thing that Israel has actually succeeded in doing is devastating what is above ground in Gaza.
And prolonging the war.
And prolonging the war. And American policy is in a total mess. If you examine it, it is, we want to build a Palestinian state, or let's let Israel destroy one before we build it. I mean, it's crazy. That there is no plan B for post-Hamas governance of Gaza. The clan chiefs have refused it. They've stuck with Hamas. The PA are nowhere and wouldn't be welcomed there. And the people are not revolting against Hamas, which also could have happened. They could have been starved into submission. They could have said, we've had enough of this. We want someone else to take over the Great Strike. There's no sign of that. And that isn't Hamas propaganda. That's true. There is no evidence of a popular revolt against Hamas under the most dire humanitarian situations when people are on the verge of mass famine. And so all of these things are a stake in the knife to the original policy of Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and Biden into how to deal with this crisis. This crisis needed a definitive hammer blow to Hamas and to do it fairly quickly. And none of that has happened. So we're now in a forever war. It could be a low-level war, and we are definitely in an expanding conflict. It's not now just about Gaza. It's about all of Israel's borders. They're all soft. Now, the other thing that happened on Saturday, which will have potentially real consequences, is that Israel crowed, very unwisely in my view, about the cooperation they received from the Jordanian Air Force in shooting down drones over Jordanian airspace.
Very publicly thanking the King of Jordan.
Yeah. And on their side of the Jordan Valley, not on Israel's side. That really is difficult for the king because he's a weak king. He's not like King Hussein, who fought the Israelis with honor, but then made peace with his great friend Yitzhak Rabin. But King Hussein never fought an Israeli battle for them. This is unprecedented. And the problem that is a real problem for, on one hand, you could say, yes, this is about Jordan protecting the sovereignty of its airspace. But on the other, it is Jordan shooting down the missiles that the people of Jordan, both the East Bankers and the Jordanians and the Palestinians, are wishing onto their target. There is a huge wave of support for Hamas and for resistance in general, as a result of the massacres that they've seen and witnessed in Gaza, that has been building up and up and up. This is the place. Jordan is a place where these demonstrations have been the keenest, and there have been mounting calls to ditch the treaty with the peace treaty with Israel, close the embassy, which is closed anyway, but is protected. There are no diplomats there, and to cut off all relations with Israel. And so the Jordanian regime have been hovering between trying to suppress the demonstrations by arrests, the usual thing.
And keep people from flooding over the borders into the West Bank, essentially, yeah.
Exactly. And also saying, yes, we're with you, we're expressing our thing. But the main thing that is powering these demonstrations, in pro-Hamas demonstrations in Jordan, is the West Bank. And it's the simple calculus that if Israel succeeds in wiping out Hamas in Gaza and crushing Gaza and turning it into sort of one giant tent city and forcing Palestinians bit by bit onto the boats and away, they can do the same thing in the West Bank. The West Bank is next. If that model succeeds, the West Bank is next. So one can't underestimate the long-term reverberations in Jordan and the instability that would be that would create in Jordan of the Jordanian regime that is hovering like a tiny fragile vessel between some extremely sharp rocks. It's trying to navigate between all these very, very sharp rocks in a white water stream, flowing stream.
Well, this is interesting because, kind of brings us to this kind of bigger existential question of the pre-October 7 and the post-October 7 realities. Because when you talk about Iran and you talk about this position that Jordan found itself in on Saturday, which might regret as a result, but there are a whole bunch of other countries that are stuck in the middle between Israel and Iran. And all of these countries have been trying to walk a very dangerous tightrope over the last 6 months in terms of what their people want them to do and what their allies in the US or Israel, in the case of the UAE and Qatar and Jordan and Egypt, expect from them. And they have chosen the path of least resistance, right? They make strong statements, but they retain and refuse to get engaged, trying to avoid any potential spillout. And the wisdom, flawed or unflawed, that a lot of these countries have exercised seem to be that we're going to let Israel ruin its own reputation. We're not going to get involved. And the kind of the weakest form of faith that we can exercise is just to let Israel kind of ruin its own war and make itself look terrible. On Saturday, Iran broke that kind of unspoken covenant, bringing the rest of the region in. And then all of a sudden you have all of these countries like Jordan that have to decide, what is my response to Iran invading my airspace and potentially heightening the situation? Do you think a lot of these countries now are going to have to pick sides if there is kind of a bigger escalation, and is that going to play in Iran's favor?
Well, optimistically, one positive outcome of this is they could start uniting around a common agenda to stop the war and to really push for some sort of Palestinian state, and not try and pretend that Palestinians don't exist, or that it's all about trade deals, or the Palestinians should just learn to be good Israelis, which was the formula used by the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman not so long ago. So their policy, talking about the Gulf states, not necessarily Jordan, but the Gulf states, was the opposite of that. Their policy was, the Palestinian issue is so much, the issue of our fathers and our grandfathers. We're a new generation here. We don't want to have relations which are subject to veto by the Palestinians. We want our own relations. There's businesses booming. Hey, let's go ahead with this. And this was the whole idea of the Abraham Accords, which Trump started. And to his great shame, Joe Biden continued and continues to this day. They still think the Abraham Accords is the basis of some sort of Middle East peace. And before October the 7th, Netanyahu was parading a map in the UN in which Palestine didn't exist. So come on, change this policy, recognize that Palestine does exist and Palestinians do exist, unite and put forward a common pressure to say, no, we're not going to do more trade deals with you, and we're going to tone down the ones we've got until there's some political progress. They could do that, and they could decide to do that as one. Because at the moment what's happening is that Israel is saying, you see, when things really are difficult for us, these guys are our allies. And that's why they were so keen on publishing the help that Jordan gave them. But it's very short-sighted. It depends how strategic they want to be. But if, let's say, the Emiratis are thinking strategically and they prize trade amongst everything else, the sine qua non of trade is peace. And if they want to push through railways to the old Hijaz railway up to Haifa through Jordan or whatever, you're not going to get any of this stuff until there is peace. And so they have to push for peace, and they have to push for actually basically a deconfliction. It's only through a deconfliction that some of these tensions can start not ramping up, not going from one failed war to another and then saying, hey, we need to deal with Iran. The only way out of this black hole that has been dug by Israel is a deconfliction on all fronts. And that will give them the excuse for the Houthis to stand down their attacks, for the Straits of Hormuz to return normally to its normal traffic, and for people to respect each other's airspace and political interests. But if you don't have that peace and you have Israel basically redrawing the map unilaterally and continuing to do things which have got nothing to do with Gaza, which we have chronicled in the Middle East Eye, the number of settled attacks in the West Bank, or the number of new houses being built in the West Bank or housing units. This is now a record flow. Every single time there's a conflict, Israel expands and puts more facts on the ground. Well, that logic has to be undone, and the only people who can do it are the neighbours. And I think I'm speaking very optimistically here, but there is an opportunity to fill the vacuum created by the appalling crash of another major Western policy. Now, Cameron can get up in the comments and say what he wants, right? So can Sunak, and so can Biden, and all of these guys can say this is about making the defense of Israel. This is why we need a defense, but they cannot secure Israel's defense. Practically, they can't do it. They can't secure Ukraine's defense. They couldn't secure Aramco's defense. That umbrella is no longer working. So there has to be, whatever the rhetoric, there has to be a fundamental shift of policy, which is how peace has to be reestablished through mutual consent rather than one power imposing its conditions and imposing its border on others. And it's no use simply saying that Israel has very strong relationships with the Gulf states. It has strong relationships with the Gulf elites who absolutely know where their bread is buttered, because the Palestinian issue is so closely linked to the Arab Spring, and so it's people to people, that they feel threatened because they have a lack of legitimacy as well. And they know that they are, if they help the Palestinians gain their state, their Turk is voting for Christmas, because this is also about the corruptness of the Arab state. So they have no interest in actually making sure that there is peace. Now, one's got to change that paradigm around, and so that things are working and flowing in the same direction. So that is a genuine commercial, political, and sovereignty issue in establishing peaceful relations. This is the only way this will be solved. If you go down the other path and you keep on lighting fires in the Middle East, you are eventually going to get to Jordan is going to crumble. Mm-hmm. You can see it. You can feel it. And you're going to have another issue in another failed state as well. What has 3 decades of this policy brought the Middle East, except a whole bunch of ruined countries? Do you want to ruin Jordan as well? I mean, if you challenge Biden and say, you want to build a Palestinian state, you want to build states, not destroy them, what are you doing helping Israel destroy a state in Gaza?
The last thing I want to ask you is with regards to those 3 decades of policies, but also this election year that we're in, and this almost dark king in waiting in Trump and the Republicans, who are expecting to come back into power this year, unless Trump goes to prison, and they have always been obsessed with the idea of Iran, and there are so many Iran hawks that are still in the. I mean, John Bolton was one of them who's come out, the scathing critique of Biden, calling him embarrassing and calling him weak for not showing a greater show of force against Iran. This also is adding a lot of pressure on the Biden administration, months ahead of an election, to look tougher on Iran and to show that he is kind of doing something to not only protect Israel, but to protect the U.S.'s perceived interests in the region.
Well, when push came to shove, I seem to remember that Trump didn't attack Iran. He had the opportunity. Mm. He killed Soleimani instead, but he didn't attack Iran. I think an election year, there are so many variables. I think Biden will be punished quite heavily for his support with Israel amongst the Arab American community. But I don't think that's necessarily the end of the story. I think he will have quite a lot of votes from blue-collar workers. I think there are other factors as well, like I don't necessarily think that women, after losing a lot of their abortion rights in many states, are going to be that keen on Trump and the far right coming back and the evangelical right coming back in to power again. So I generally think it's difficult to call this election. There are different factors going on. And then there's Trump himself. And Trump, when he comes back into power, if he comes back into power, will not necessarily be thinking about big strategic issues. Obviously, he'll want to use his relationship with Putin to come in and stamp some sort of very untidy solution or one very untidy ceasefire on Ukraine. That is a definite possibility. But Trump will be motivated by revenge when he comes back into power. And it'll be revenge against
Democrats.
Against Democrats. So this will be a much more, forget transactional, there's a much more wild character to this presidency, where it is personally motivated by getting back at the people who took his money away or embarrassed him or stole his election in the first place. So there'll be a lot about Trump, if he returns, that will be about America And I'm not sure he'll have a huge amount of energy for rearranging
leading a regional war.
A regional war. That said, it was under Trump and particularly under Kushner that the settlers had their, they had a state where Israel could literally set the agenda and do everything it wanted, including getting America to reverse a policy it had held for decades and shift its embassy to Jerusalem. So Netanyahu enjoyed probably his best time, his freest time under Trump. Whether that returns under Trump too, there are basically too many variables. But I wouldn't rule Biden out. But that said, you've still got, whether it's Trump or anyone else, a failed American policy. And the longer, Netanyahu completely miscalculated. They thought that if we really destroy Gaza and do it in a prolonged way, Hamas will come out with their hands up. And that hasn't happened. They've faced, and they were probably right to think that they would, because the PLO didn't act like this. The PLO put up a fight and then left. Hamas is staying on the ground and staying there. They haven't had that sort of determined Palestinian resistance against overwhelming firepower, overwhelming odds, and mass casualties day in, day out for 6 months, now in its 7th month. Israel's never faced this before. They've never faced a Palestinian enemy that hasn't, at one point, come out of the building with a white flag, and they're not doing it. And I don't think they will do it. So this is a new situation. This is a forever war. This isn't a limited incursion. So this is the basis on which all of these policy decisions are made. And if I were America, I'd be deeply troubled by the situation now. And I would be looking around for ways of closing this down.
David Hearst, it's been a pleasure having you with us. Thank you very much for your analysis.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Big Picture. A big thank you to David Hearst for coming back on the show and being our guest today. We want to hear what you have to say about everything that has happened over the last couple of days with Iran, with Israel, with the United States, and of course, primarily in Gaza. Please share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know who you'd like us to bring on the show next. As always, you can listen to all of our episodes in audio format wherever you get your podcasts from. And until next time, salam.